the ADA has made efforts to allow our community to be audience members, but it hasn't really, in the 33 years it has been around, it hasn't really made efforts to create access for those of us that want to be on that stage.
All right. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another fabulous episode of the Healthcare Trailblazers podcast. I've gotten good at saying that. Fun, a little different and fun today. We're sitting with Danny Woodburn. Some of you may recognize him, some of you may not. Danny is an actor. I personally know him from Seinfeld because I'm a Seinfeld guy. Danny, in addition to his acting career, is a big advocate for the disabled community. And so today we're going to do something really interesting. We're going to talk to Danny about the issues, the healthcare issues that pertain to the disabled community. And specifically, we're going to be able to focus on this new model of value-based care that so many of you are familiar with from listening to the podcast, and possibly brainstorm some challenges that may arise, or when in regards to the disabled community, or possibly not. Maybe we'll come up with a bunch of solutions that will solve the world's problems. So, Danny, thank you so much for taking the time and being here today. Let's start from where'd you grow up, and early on career, your path to acting in Hollywood. Let's start there.
Yeah, I grew up on the East Coast. I'm a Philly boy, cheesesteak lover, and cool. Coming up, I was always kind of a clown, entertaining, and probably used it as a defense mechanism to keep from being bullied, as many comedians have in their life. But growing up, I definitely had my experiences with the healthcare industry. I've had multiple operations, beginning in infancy and going into adolescence and going into young adulthood, which actually slowed my college career down, my ability to move out into the world as fast as others. But I eventually made it to California after doing some theater and graduating from Temple University's theater department, theater and film, and moved to Los Angeles. And, back then it was all pounding the pavement, no internet, no way to connect via social media, none of that. So social media was, outside knocking on doors. And so that was sort of the start of everything. And then landing Seinfeld at a time when maybe there were a handful of networks and not too much cable happenings back then. It launched my career. And
Cool.
Throughout my career, I was always an advocate for myself as a performer, not wanting to do certain things, certain kinds of roles that I felt were demeaning. But then in looking at the ways in which disability was depicted overall, I started to sort of get involved in that and became a member of the Performers with Disabilities Committee. And at present, I've probably been involved with them for 25 years. And at present, I am co-vice chair of the Performers with Disabilities Committee at the SAG-AFTRA union.
Cool. So, couple questions. When you started in Hollywood, was it difficult? What was the climate for people with disability in Hollywood? Was it they were just trying to cast you as?
It was non-existent. I mean, people didn't make effort to look for, say a wheelchair user. They would just hire anybody that they felt was right for the job, based on auditions and whatnot, not understanding the access to education or the access to opportunity that was much more severely limited for people with disability. Let's just take a wheelchair user, for example. If they wanted to, say, study comedy at Second City in Hollywood, the improv troupe, the Second City stages in Hollywood are upstairs in an old Hollywood building. You have to take probably a 30 step hike up from the street to get to the stage. And then, of course, once you're on the stage, how do you get on the stage? How do you get on and off the stage? From, let's say, so the ADA has made efforts to allow our community to be audience members, but it hasn't really, in the 33 years it has been around, it hasn't really made efforts to create access for those of us that want to be on that stage. That's where, that's where I cut my chops, is being a performer on stage. And so if I didn't have the mobility I had then to get on and off the stage and be that performer, I wouldn't have these opportunities. And the same goes true for people in the deaf community. We have now we can name more than just Marley Matlin. We've seen other people in the deaf community showing up and getting opportunity. Um, there was a young man with Down syndrome on a series in the '80s called Life Goes On. Chris, his last name escapes me, but uh, that was our go-to understanding of somebody with Down syndrome, that one kid on TV. But now
Yeah.
we've seen Zach Gonchalken in the Peanut Butter Falcon. We've seen other members, the Lauren Potter on Glee. We've seen other members of that community, and we've seen them authentically represented, versus, say, Cuba Gooding Jr. playing radio. You know, uh, we want to give opportunity to these folks to represent themselves authentically because of the tropes that have occurred with disability over the years. Just to name a few, the holy, sort of the holy angelic figure of a person with disability, or the angry, bitter person with disability, the superhero with disability. We saw all these different tropes around disability, but never really getting to an authentic representation. And so that's sort of been my area of advocacy too,
Yeah.
creating these pathways for folks like that.
Yeah. So how did you break through? And what, you said it was non-existent, really, that space for you when
Yeah,
you were in Hollywood.
my first agent was a woman named Coralie Jr., my first Hollywood agent, who actually happened to be Cuba Gooding Jr.'s agent as well at the time. And Coralie, great lady that she was, old school Hollywood. So I walked into her, wood paneled offices. And she took one look at me and said, "How tall are you?" And I said, "I'm 4 foot." And she said, "You're perfect because you're right in the middle between 3 foot 6 and 4 foot and 4 foot and 4 foot 6. They're going to call for you every time." And I was like, whatever that means. I mean, do you want to see my resume? Do you want to see my acting? Do you want to see anything else? And it's like, no, it was just about being that,
Right.
fitting into that niche for her. She used to put out in the Variety every year a big photograph of all of her stable of little people, with the catchphrase, "The one to call when you need someone small." And
Wow.
it was a line of little people lined up by order of height. I never involved myself in that group shot, and I'm grateful for that. But
I
that's what the climate was back then.
Yeah. Yeah. So were you kind of getting always the same role pitched to you, of some sort of comedic version of something that you felt
Yeah, I
wasn't
mean, as a sight gag of some sort, something to be humiliated, an object on the screen. Always the uh, evil creatures or whatever. And
right?
my goal was to just find something with dimension, personality, some kind of heart, maybe,
Yeah.
not some sort
So
of.
so let's do some hot takes. So looking back at Seinfeld, how do you feel that how do you feel that depiction was? There's that scene where you come in and George calls, offhand calls a midget, and then they're like, that's not,
Right,
it's little
right.
people, and there's that whole thing. But in a way, to the viewer. I'd like to hear your view from the actor to the viewer. It
Well,
sounds like,
in the original script, it wasn't addressed that it was offensive. It was not addressed. It was just an offhanded comment,
oh really?
and yeah, and I let it be known that it's not correct terminology. It's dehumanizing. It's born out of the sale of little people in the circus by P.T. Barnum. That's a made up word. It doesn't exist as far as a descriptive of any human being. And I let them know it was offensive, and people really legitimately didn't have that knowledge back then. So I said, I can't have myself be called that and not address it. And so in addressing that in those moments, Michael Richards, I turn and I say, you see the physical threat that I'm about to bring down on George. It's little people. You got that? And Michael Richards says, "Easy, Mickey, easy." And that was sort of the spark of like everything that Mickey became after that. This like volatile guy ready to throw down. But it
Right.
came organically. It came organically out of that. Like not just arguing with Kramer, but like he was willing to fight with anyone.
Right.
And so that's what that is born out of, you know. And that's what I mean when I talk about being my own advocate. In those moments, I feel like those are the moments that change my career path. And throughout all of these kinds of things, I have a number of stories like that as well. In making sure that my career path was on the right trajectory, and not to be like, for example, the one offer I had was, to come and be like a butler on a show, but I walk around with hors d'oeuvres on a tray, on my head. Right. So that was that was like one offer that came across the table. And I'm like, there's no way I'm doing that.
Right.
You know, but
Right.
somebody's going to do that. Somebody's going to find that role and be okay with that.
Right.
And
So
because that's sort of Hollywood is built on that kind of
yeah,
desperation in a lot of ways.
yeah, yeah. It's entertainment. Sometimes they sacrifice the values for the sake
And
of
the
it.
same, and that's sort of true of a lot of disability in that sense. And we can go back and look at, people with morbid obesity and how they've been treated in film and television for decades, and LGBTQ community, how they've been treated in film and television for decades. It's and usually represented by people that were not part of that community,
Right.
in a lot of respects.
So I think there's two sides to this. It sounds like there's the one side where there's often where you have a character that is disabled in the script, and that person is, and that opportunity is given to somebody that just is a resume and doesn't have that disability,
Right.
and possibly you want those roles to be actually acted by people that understand that fully.
I certainly would like that. I understand what acting is, but I also understand the disparity in the access to opportunity and the access to employment and just the physical access to the job.
Yeah.
Right. And the lack of a desire from our industry to create those access points.
Yeah.
Um, and it's only as little as, 5-6 years ago, where everybody got crazy about Oscars So White campaign, that the Motion Picture Academy, Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences, said, what we're going to do? We're going to add 100 new members, people of color and women, to our membership, so that we can, more accurately say we are depicting and awarding people in this community for the work that they do. But not one of those members was a member with disability.
Right.
So that complete separation of people with disabilities from that community.
Right. So you feel
Of
like it's just totally looked over, and we love to split each other up over races and focus on certain inequalities and inequities in certain race groups, but we are just looking over the disabled community.
I think a lot of times too, it just comes to like what's in vogue at the moment. Like what are we going to advocate for this week?
Yeah.
You know, and
Advocacy of the month.
yeah, exactly. So that's where disability was never had its own month.
Right. So
And
so let's move this to healthcare a little bit. So when we initially sat down, we talked about the topic of this podcast typically is value-based care, and I kind of touched on it a little bit, and then immediately you had some thoughts on how that can fit in, or possibly where it doesn't fit in with the disabled community. So let's restart that conversation. So what value-based care looks like is right now the world. Right now, the financial structure of healthcare, generally speaking, is called fee for service, which means that the doctor does a thing, he gets paid for said thing, right? And
or
that's why
a provider.
a provider, right?
They don't like to be called doctors nowadays.
Yeah,
They're providers.
that's your esteemed father-in-law's issue with the system.
That is true.
You
But
read the book. What a good son-in-law! Wow.
I have an understanding of it from a long time,
Right.
hanging out with him.
So, and in that scenario, essentially, the doctor is actually incentivized for you to be sick because, and that's where you get into this ridiculous rat race where the patient comes in and they're trying to, like, you go to urgent care and they're trying to, take your blood pressure and check this, check that, check the other, even though I came in for this, you know what I mean? But they're checking everything because everything is another code that they're billing and they're able to get reimbursed based on that. So in that structure, essentially, the doctor does not get paid unless the patient is sick. And sick can mean sick. It can mean limb broken. It can mean whatever it is, right? What value-based care looks like is you essentially say, all right, I'm going to give you $10 for Danny's health, but I'm going to give you $10 for 10,000 Danny's healths. Danny's is healths. Anyway. And then now but I, as the doctor, am now responsible for your health fully, period. Okay? So now what I have to say, my game, if I want to make money, is say, okay, how can I make sure that I manage this population of Danny's so well that only like 2% of them are actually, basically as little as possible are really acute and are going into the hospital and are having hospitalizations, rehospitalizations, stuff like that. And I manage this population so well that the majority of them, let's say 60%, really don't even need intense services. It's all preventive care stuff to keep things from falling.
Who's giving the doctor $10?
The payer. That can mean Medicare, that can mean a private insurance, that can mean whatever.
Or it can be the person.
No, this would have to work at a pay your level because they're the ones that have that huge population to say, I'm going to sign it. Because take an employer, right? An employer has 10,000 employees, so they're able to negotiate these types of contracts with an insurance, right? Or same goes for the hospital. If a hospital has, 50,000 patients that belong to one plan, that's when you can start negotiating what those terms are, right? For me as a single person, it's very difficult to say, hey, here's how I want my healthcare done.
But what if you lose insurance?
What if the patient loses insurance? That's definitely an issue. But in the insurance game, this is in the paying game. This is just I'm trying to describe the model of how this payment goes versus the current system. So now basically my job becomes how do I keep my patients healthy so that I can keep all that money and not spend it on them. Right. So a great example is, if and I just like the simplest example, but in a fee-for-service world, if I have an elderly patient, she's 70 years old and she's at home, she doesn't have a bar in her shower, right? She slips, she falls, breaks her hip, comes in. That's the best day in the world to me because that's $150,000 surgery that I get paid for, right? In the latter thing with value-based care, I will definitely spend $50 to have a care coordinator call this elderly lady and talk to her, realize that she doesn't have that bar in her shower, coordinate some care so that she gets the bar in her shower so that she does not fall, because if she falls and breaks her hip, I'm paying $150,000. So I just spent $100 on preventive care and coordination and statistically saved myself $150,000 surgery, right?
Here's where I get a little cautious about that, because now let's say the doctor says, well, I don't have that kind of money, and this person's really old, or they already have disability, and that shouldn't be my responsibility. This person's really old, and they fell even though they have a bar, but maybe they weren't using it properly or whatever, or there's some other underlying issue that caused them to fall that I was not aware of. What's to prevent the doctor from figuring out another way to treat this patient that is not the surgery they need, that is not a hip replacement surgery, but like maybe it's going to be cheaper. This person is 93. They maybe have another year of life. It would cost maybe 50, maybe 80,000 for me to have a care person take care of them, make sure they have all their needs, take care of them for the rest of their life, for the next 2 years, whatever. Because now that I've not given them surgery and now that I've not treated them, I am well aware that their health is going to decline anyway. So they probably won't live that long, and I won't be responsible for them later. So I'll save myself $60,000 because I didn't do the surgery and I paid for a care provider to be with them. What would prevent a doctor from going down that path?
Yeah, sure. So a couple things. That's a super niche example of somebody that's really at the end of life and this and the other. But I would say two things. First of all, in the scenario where the doctor says, I don't have the money, it's not the doctor, it's typically a larger system. So you're a failed organization if you can't pay your bills. You're essentially saying, hey, I can't pay my bills. If you can't pay your bills, you shut down, just like any other business, right? The other thing is that, again, it aligns the actual objective of patient care with financial incentives. So I am not doing myself any favor by taking shortcuts with the patient's care if they're just going to end up back in the hospital for something else. If I don't give them the right care and the right fix, so to speak, then I'm not.
They're not going to get admitted to the hospital unless you admit them. You might say, well, it's time for hospice.
No, hospitals will have to take it, and they're going to send me the bill. They would have to take that patient, and I'm going to be responsible for paying the bill because I took responsibility for this patient's for paying for this patient's care. So either I do it well, or the patient, or if I'm not doing it well, then patient then I end up just paying again and again. It would be like, buying a bad quality soccer ball, right? If I'm actually trying to win the sport, and I don't want to have to, then I don't do myself any favors by going cheap on the soccer ball, right? Because then I'm just going to have to keep buying a new one because it's going to keep breaking. It makes a lot of sense for me to put in the right thing at the outset so that my objective, which is win the game, is going to actually happen, right? I think this might help with a good example. I have this friend that started a company, and he ended up selling it for just a lot of money. It was a full risk organization. So when I say risk, it's that contract that I just described. And he built it to a couple thousand employees in a bunch of locations. And at one point, he had a doctor who he was paying a full salary of whatever it is, $350,000. Paid this doctor, and the doctor's entire caseload was 7 patients. And
so that's a concierge service kind of a thing.
I mean, call it what you want, but in the practice, he had a doctor, and the doctor's entire responsibility was 7 patients. Why? Well, the patients weren't paying any different. The patients were all on Medicare. So concierge, usually you get better or worse based on meaning I will get better care if I pay more money. This was all the patients were paying the same amount of money, but he took a doctor and said, you're responsible for these 7 patients. Why? Because he did the math, and he realized that these 7 patients were so out of hand, their health was so out of hand, that they were costing him $2 million a year. And so because he's incentivized to keep these patients managed, now it made sense for him to take a doctor that's going to cost him $350,000 and say, manage the crap out of these patients. Make sure they're so well taken care of that they rarely have any complications and end up in the hospital. And
these were his employees?
Yeah. Well, the doctor was an employee. The patients were regular patients.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
So
that's a good example.
So,
right?
So the business he was an insurance provider then, essentially?
No, he was the doctor. So he had a gigantic practice, but let's call him the doctor, okay? Yeah. And so he had dozens of doctors working for him, and he had these contracts with the payers, who is the insurance, to say, pay me, like I said earlier, pay me the $10 for all these 10,000 or 100,000, whatever it is, patients. And then that's it. It's on me, right? So now he has to figure out, how do I take care of the patients best so that they don't end up needing so much care? And the best way to do that is with preventive care. And so I think let's bring that back to the disabled community with your thoughts. What if you can describe kind of some of the hardships that are kind of exclusive to the disabled community? Some might seem obvious, but I've learned in life that never assume, because I'll probably find out something interesting. So let's talk about healthcare for the disabled. What are some contrasting differences?
Well, the thing about the disability community that's so diverse as it is, right? So, but like, let's just sort of, well, I think that for me, the biggest concern is anybody that is, as I said, that is trying to earn a living and make money and keep their benefits. It's a dicey balancing act. So I think there's always a concern that the disabled community might lose Medicaid. They might lose certain aspects of healthcare. Also, the idea of pre-existing conditions. I mean, I have a congenital dwarfism. There's not a lot of things that are more pre-existing than the word congenital. So technically, I have a pre-existing condition. And what goes along with this is that my body's DNA doesn't send out the message to deliver collagen number 2 to my joints or my eyes,
Okay.
and wherever else collagen COL2 is supposed to go. So my DNA doesn't do that. And then, of course, I have a skeleton that is at times in need of repair. It's like a stilt house on a on an ever under siege stormy coastline. You know what I mean? So it's I've had probably 30 different orthopedics procedures in my
Wow.
lifetime, and at some point somebody with SCD congenita, which is what I have, doesn't have all their original parts. Um, and So, what does my ongoing care mean? How much preventative do you get? Right. So I have two prosthetic hips at this point in my life. I'm 58. My first one came when I was 50. My second one came when I was 54. But prior to that, I had multiple bilateral osteotomies, hips, knees, and ankles, which sort of like corrected the stilts of the stilt house, right?
Okay.
So at some point the knees came together, the hips splayed out, the ankles rolled in, and things needed to be,
You wore a
really
brace?
straightened up. When I was 5, some doctors believe in bracing. I had a procedure on my knees to straighten my knees uh, between the ages of 4 and 5. And then I wore body casts until I went to kindergarten, where I wore braces on my legs. That was the only time I wore braces on my legs in kindergarten. Then
Okay.
I had a similar procedure done to my hips when I was 11, 12, 11 or 12, 11 to 12, and did not wear a brace, but was in a body cast for several months. And then, I think the surgeries began in July, and I had two major hip operations of uh, well over 8 hours long a piece, and was in a body cast through probably October of that same year, and then was going to school on a stretcher. Junior high school, I started on a stretcher, so I got brought. My parents had to buy a station wagon, right? So how do you adjust for costs when your parents now to get their son around to and fro
One
a
second.
hospital?
You were brought in and out of the classroom every day in a stretcher,
Yeah,
and you stayed in the stretcher in class.
all day long.
Oh my
And I
goodness.
went
How
from
old were
class
you?
to class. I went from class to class. So this was junior high. So I went, went from homeroom to English to social studies to math. Well, I didn't go to math because math was on the second floor, and I didn't go to gym. So I didn't go to math, I didn't go to gym, and I didn't go to my language class. I was taking German back then for some bizarre reason because my older brother took the language of German, and he said, "Oh, it's the hardest one to learn of the three that they offered: Spanish, French, and German." I wish I had taken Spanish instead, but I took German and dropped out of it because, I was just listening to tapes at home at night, not really enjoying a class opportunity, and I never learned base 8. I never understood that in my math class because that was part of the math that I wasn't there for. So it was a good portion of the year where my math teacher, Mr. Lactus, who wore either a green sweater vest and green outfit or an orange sweater vest and orange outfit. Those were his two. He was sort of like a pseudo Einstein in that way.
Okay.
And the only time I ever saw him was when he came down to make a phone call every afternoon, probably at his lunch to call home. And he stood on the payphone. But other than that, during math and during gym and during lunch, I was wheeled into the library. My mother would come, bring my lunch. I would eat on the stretcher. If I had to go to the bathroom, that was the time to go. She would leave. Uh, Another kid would take me to my next class on the stretcher, roll me in. And at the end of the day, my mom and my stepdad would come and pick me up and take me home. And that entailed lifting me off the stretcher, carrying me down a flight of steps to the front of the school, putting me in the back of a station wagon and driving home, taking me out of the station wagon, carrying me in all added 50 pounds of plaster pants into the apartment that we lived in at the time.
And how long was this part of your life?
Uh, for the first few months of my first junior high school year.
That's insane.
It was a good way to meet girls, I think, back then, because I only ever had girls wheel me to and from class. Um, Mary Gavala, Angie Mason. Those were the two girls I remember that wheeled me to and from class.
Wow.
There was the occasional time when one girl or another wasn't there. And I remember one time I was trying to make it to English, and somehow I lost one of the girls and in the crowd, and I was left in the hallway.
Oh
So I
no.
pulled myself along the wall of the lockers until I made it to
Oh
my
my
English
goodness.
class. And
Oh my goodness.
I
You
called my
worked for your education.
I did. I did. Um,
Wow. Wow. You must have been a really
so,
good student though, because you
so,
obviously cared.
yeah, and I wanted to go. I wanted to go every day.
Yeah.
So, that there's the added expense for my family of having to
Yeah.
buy a station wagon.
Yeah. And your mother having to show up, she can't have a normal job if she has to show up
No,
every day. And
no, and we're lucky because my stepfather was a really excellent provider. He wasn't even my stepfather then. He was my mom's boyfriend. For the
right.
first 10 years that they were together.
Right.
Um, but he did a lot for our family,
Oh.
and part of it was to help us, buy a station wagon.
Yeah.
Uh, you know, um,
So you were starting to talk about like you're kind of brainstorming what kind of preventive measures could be taken when it comes to the disabled community. So, but like the typical things that you think through when it comes to general illnesses is exercise, diet, things like that. Is there anything that would help manage? Let's talk about like you specifically. Looking back, is there anything that would have helped manage and maybe prevent some of the surgeries that you had to go through, or it was just it is what it is, it had to
I mean,
happen?
I'm a kid, right? I'm a kid. I have the potential to be paralyzed if I'm wrestling with my brothers because of the C-spine instability in my neck. Um, This happened to friends of mine who had to go in for emergency surgery to have their C-spines fused. They have the same syndrome I do. I was just lucky in my lifetime to never have that issue. But it's not that it doesn't exist. It just never became an issue
Right.
that was symptomatic. So how do you prevent that issue without performing a surgery that may or may not be necessary
Right. Right.
on
No, I don't think. Yeah, I don't think.
a
But
10-year-old?
let's
You know
say
what I mean?
you got your hips at 50. You know, was that inevitable? Was that just a matter of when?
It was inevitable, but I think the osteotomies were something that prolonged the life of my hips.
Mm-hmm.
I think I have a genetic predisposition to being overweight because of the rest of my family. Um, so some of that is genetic, obviously. Some of it is willpower, etc. It just depends on what we have in our. I know some people can eat endlessly and never have to worry about their weight, and others
Right.
can eat, two crackers and a bowl of soup, and all of a
Mm-hmm.
sudden they ballooned up. It's just there's no real way to say we understand everything there is to understand about weight gain and weight loss.
Right.
Um, uh,
So
so
let me.
preventative for me, what I have said, yeah, do all these surgeries on him now, uh, or not. I don't know that would have been good preventative measure. To limit my childhood, like say, oh, don't go play street hockey because it's a lot of wear and tear on your hips. Don't go do the things that you want to do.
Right.
Don't dive off a diving board because you have potential to have C-spine instability. Don't do any of these things that you want to do as a little kid. How do you do that with a child who wants to be part of the rest of the community,
Yeah. Yeah.
without limiting their life experience?
Yeah. Let's switch gears a little bit because we talked earlier about in Hollywood the depictions of the disabled community, and with the rise of new media, let's call it, with YouTube and TikTok and all these content creators and all that, which is probably the bottom half of Hollywood at this point. um,
They're
I see in
they're
my.
all in the streets. Content creators are walking the streets
I
right now.
know. It's a horrible thing. But I see in my feed sometimes accounts that revolve around a family member that's disabled. Sometimes it's the person themselves, in which case it's absolutely empowering, right? If someone like you were to talk about, like you're doing here, talk about what you've been through, what you go through, et cetera, that's absolutely empowering and speaks to the grit and the mental fortitude and all that you have and had to build to get through to where you are today. But sometimes you see these accounts where it seems like it's a family member that is building this account and garnering hundreds of thousands or millions of views and followers, etc., around a family member that's disabled. And it seems sweet and it seems beautiful, but sometimes it's just like I
It's
question,
exploitative.
where is the
Yeah, I
line?
think it's exploitative. I think the line is, um, when you have someone with who has a cognitive disability. My brother, for example, has Down syndrome. So if he were born today and my mom were sort of using his Down syndrome to get views and then in turn make money, what is the money going towards? Is it going towards his future? Is it going toward his future planning for when she's not around? What it really depends on what the exploitation is, and it also, we can call it exploitation when it comes down to money, but also we can call it exploitation when it comes down to a certain perception of disability, where there's a pathos around, around pity, or around them, being, filling in one of those tropes, like though they're angels on earth. I've heard that said about people with Down syndrome. They're angels on earth. Well, it's like, yes, okay, there's a lot of wonderful people with Down syndrome, but you know, he's my brother. We've fought. We still fight. He'll yell at me and hang up.
This angel punches.
Yeah. You go back to our teenage years, and it's like somebody's throwing a frying pan at somebody. You know what I mean?
Right.
We love each other, but at the same time, that he's a human being. He's not this angelic creature sent by God to make us all better.
Yeah.
He's him.
Yeah.
He's who he is.
Yeah.
And a lot of people find him to be wonderful, and I think he's got a great sense of humor, and he is charming and funny and all those things. But he's also a pain in my ass sometimes. So that's it's about understanding that people with disability of all stripes are not one thing, and that's where we get into exploitation, when we paint them as this one thing, that they're to
Mhm.
be paid, or that they're to be treasured because they're special. So I have a good friend of mine that talks about special education, and it's like, isn't all education supposed to be special? um, it's not special. You just want one. You
Right.
just want an education.
Right.
It's a label we've given it, uh, to. That's the thing too about oh, he's special. It's a label we've given it to soften the blow of the word disability. We get all we for 100 years, we since the word disabled came in, even after handicapped, people are still bent out of shape about it. They're not dead; they're differently abled. We have to sort of soften the blow of disability rather than embracing it and saying, there's nothing wrong with it. It's just another aspect of this person's life. Um, but on the other end of that word can sometimes trigger people's responses, especially in the medical profession. So my brother, he at the end of last year on his birthday, he suffered a aortic tear and an aneurysm that put him in the hospital. And within a week of being in the hospital, he had a heart attack. He had emergency surgery to fix the aortic tear. He had another emergency procedure to put in a shunt and to clear a block after his heart attack. Then he needed to be cardioverted. There was all kinds of things that went on with him, and part of it has to do with his own eating habits throughout his life. But part of it has to do with the fact that he has Down syndrome. Is sometimes people with Down syndrome are predisposed to being overweight. Um, uh, but how much preventative care can I do with my brother if he's like, well, I didn't eat that much, I didn't do that much. There's only so much preventative care I can offer him that he's going to adhere to without maybe constant monitoring in his life. And then that
Right.
limits his independence as an individual, because he's got a tremendous amount of independence and a sense of that desire for independence. But at the same time, when it came time for him to when the hospital wanted him out, when they wanted him out, they made it known and they did their best to get him out. And what were the qualifications? he can walk 150 feet with a walker. And I was like, yes, but he's on 11 different medications. He doesn't know the first thing about how to take them. We don't have anybody in place for him to help him with this. So we need to figure something else out. And there, it was a battle with that hospital to try to figure out what to do with my brother, because insurance companies said they didn't look at his Down syndrome, they didn't look at his cognitive ability, they didn't look at anything else. They looked at 150 feet, that he could walk 150 feet assisted. Boom, that's it. You qualify to go home.
Check.
We checked the box. And that's what insurance is now, regardless of pre-existing conditions, disability. They say it's up to you now to figure it out. We can't have you in the hospital anymore.
Right.
And the same thing with me. I went into the hospital for my last 2 hip surgeries, right? So I have my dwarfism and I have my osteotomies that have made my hip operations, my prosthetic hip operations, more complicated. So instead of minimally invasive, where they just go into a little 1 to 2 inch hole, they got to open me up. It's a fully open surgery where they get in there and they move shit around. I had an osteotomy on one side, and it laid me up a little extra longer, made my recovery more difficult. But that doesn't stop the counselor assigned to me from coming in and saying, it's time to go. You ready to go? It's been 2 days. And I'm like, I remember when I was a kid, I'd go in for an arthrogram and I'd be 5 days in the hospital after an arthrogram. But now it's major surgery, a hip replacement, and they want me out in 48 hours because they're like, you stood up, you used the bathroom, you can go. And it's like, yeah, but I can barely frickin' move here. Then you've left it all to home care. You've left it all to home care. So as a result of that, I had to hire a nurse for us to have that at home, out of pocket. That's all out of pocket. Yeah. So that's what insurance companies are doing now. They get you in, they do the thing, we're done with you, get out. 150 feet, get out. 2 days after hip surgery, get out. Not, we did, this person has dwarfism. We did an osteotomy. We did it fully open. This is not a traditional hip. This was had been reshaped inside their body and then reshaped again. And so it made it more complicated. We don't care.
Right.
2 days, 48 hours, hip surgery. That's the protocol. Get out.
Right. So I think that possibly we've come to a good example where this model maybe can help, because again, what you're describing is short-minded vision. If I only get paid for as long as you're here, then and then I have a max on it, so now I'm not getting paid, and just like then get out. But if I'm responsible for you, then I need to figure out, first of all, I am going to look at all that. And a big part of preventive care is looking at social determinants of health and population health and all that, and looking at all these various aspects to your life. And it would be in my best interest as the healthcare provider to think through those things and work with you to make sure that you get back on the horse, so to speak, and get back to your best health, and what that process looks like for you.
I'm not allowed to ride horses, by the way. C-spine keeps me off the horses.
Keep you off the horse.
Well, I understand that, and I think in theory it's a very fascinating idea. I'm concerned about it in practice because of the nature of human beings. I don't want to spend this money because then it's my profit that I'm taking out of to continue this kind of care for this particular patient.
Right.
So it's a little dicey area, and I don't know what the guarantees are of oversight. I don't know what the oversight is of that system. And that's where I would, have to really consider what's the oversight on these individual doctors who have these patients, these 10,000 Dannys. God forbid they have 10,000 Dannys, but they got 10,000 Dannys and they got $10 a piece. And they go, this Danny's costing me a little too much money out of my practice. Maybe I don't do $10 worth. I don't do $9 worth.
Or I get rid of Danny because he's messing up my ratios.
Yeah, maybe I move him to another Danny-less practice.
Right. So all those things definitely have to be checked through. I know we're coming up on time, and it's fascinating talking to you. We could probably do 5 hours of this. We could do a full hour of watching some of these TikToks of these disabled people, and you saying cringe or not cringe, But if you could
disability porn, that's what they call it, disability porn.
Exactly. If you could change, you're an advocate. You see the issues there. If you could change one thing in Hollywood today that would benefit the disabled community, what would it be?
I'm already doing it. I'm already making these changes. I'm already having the studios restructure the way they practice. And the backlash is always, like I had a talk with Bryan Cranston about his role in The Upside a few years back. And he said, publicity looked at this. It's not really an issue. And I'm like, it is an issue. The disability community is paying close attention to this and they're upset about it. So I said, I want you to understand why. So he said, let's meet for coffee. So we sat down and I said, you got this job and I understand why you got this job. You're a marquee name. You lend something to it. You're going to bring money to this project. But you know, admittedly, you have to say, I'm taking this job away from somebody with disability. I am. So I said, in doing that, give back three. Give back three jobs
Okay.
to three speaking roles to somebody with disability, to actors with disability. And he said, okay. And I said, well, we'll call that the Woodburn ratio. And, people get nervous about these, so-called, incentives to hire, you know, uh, anybody from a marginalized community, as quota system or whatever.
Right.
But the reality is, it's like you have to understand that these folks have not had the same opportunity, even in their education, as I just talked to you about my own life growing up. I didn't get
Right.
to go to math class on the second floor. I didn't get to go to all my class. I didn't get to go to language class because I didn't have access. And I'm not the exception to the rule. I mean, I'm the exception to the rule in getting where I got, but I'm not the exception to the rule in how I was brought up. And even in the post ADA world, we're still struggling. And so if you have my thing would be to make sure, if I could change one thing, it would be that everyone has an understanding of the stigma around disability and that everyone has an understanding of what that stigma has wrought to that person looking for a job. So if that was the one thing I could change, it would be that. And I would,
Incredible.
and I continue to do that in my work. And hopefully, you know, it becomes more practice than policy.
Yep. Yep. Well, Danny, it's fascinating to sit here and talk to you. I really appreciate the time, and I wish you continued success in your work and in your advocacy, and continuing to bring change to the community. It's fascinating. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mendel, and I hope uh, your finance model gets some legs at some point, and maybe somebody pays attention to what you're trying to do.